The early morning of June 4th, 1942, reached the Central Pacific with muted light and unstable visibility, creating a narrow, shifting horizon in which the Japanese carrier striking force advanced in coordinated formation. The four carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, moved northeast of Midway Atoll, maintaining a steady speed that reflected both confidence and adherence to a rigid operational schedule. Their escorts maintained screening positions that had been rehearsed extensively, cruisers forming an inner defensive ring, destroyers tracing protective arcs for anti-submarine vigilance, and picket elements rotating watch sectors. The sea was relatively calm, permitting smooth launch conditions. Yet the calm surface also revealed the open vulnerability that accompanied any carrier group operating at a distance from land-based air support. Every routine action on the flight decks, tool checks, fueling lines, arming equipment, was carried out according to strict procedure, but the sense of operational exposure was present all the same. On the decks themselves, ordnance teams prepared aircraft under pressure created by earlier strike decisions. Pilots and maintenance personnel worked within established timelines dictated by the first attack on Midway's installations. Returning aircraft had already reported mixed results, noting resistance from island defenses and deficiencies in damage assessment. These factors weighed on the Japanese command, prompting reconsideration of whether to launch a follow-up strike or reconfigure the air groups for anti-ship operations. Aircraft handlers had to accommodate orders that shifted abruptly, moving torpedoes, bombs, and fuel lines with limited room for error. Though these deck operations appeared efficient, they were taking place at a time when the carrier's vulnerability was at its peak. Fuel lines remained connected, bomb carts continued to move between stations, and crews attempted to manage conflicting instructions generated by evolving reconnaissance reports. The atmosphere on the bridge of Akagi reflected a blend of discipline and increasing uncertainty. Reports filtered in from scouting planes with varying degrees of reliability, creating discrepancies in identifying American fleet elements. Some messages suggested enemy carrier presence, while others offered no confirmation. The absence of cohesive intelligence contributed to delays in decision-making, prompting adjustments that cascaded downward to deck operations. The fleet's commander assessed these reports while monitoring the return window for strike aircraft and anticipating the schedule required for rearming and refueling. The lack of consistent reconnaissance forced reliance on interpretation rather than verified detection, and this uncertainty permeated every layer of command. American PBY reconnaissance had already begun to locate Japanese positions, despite sporadic cloud cover and the long distances required for observation. On Midway itself, ground crews readied their own aircraft under conditions far less favorable than those aboard the Japanese carriers. Facilities had recently absorbed damage from the morning air raid, and personnel worked under pressure accumulated from days of alerts and incomplete intelligence. Yet, despite these conditions, Midway's defenders maintained continuous readiness, aware that the Japanese approach was defined by an emphasis on concentrated carrier-based air power. The island's defense relied heavily on the assumption that American carriers remained operational and positioned to counterattack, an assumption shared by the highest levels of American naval leadership. Far to the east, the American carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown maneuvered with caution, maintaining dispersion sufficient to reduce the risk of a concentrated strike, but close enough to coordinate air group operations. Their positions had been chosen based on intelligence intercepts that indicated the probable timing and direction of the Japanese offensive. The carriers moved in deliberate patterns that avoided revealing their presence prematurely. Pilots and crew prepared for extended flight operations, aware that the success of any attack would depend heavily on locating the Japanese fleet before fuel limitations forced a return. The burden of reconnaissance, navigation, and timing rested on the aviators who would soon take off without fully knowing the location of their targets. As the morning progressed, air crews aboard the American carriers received final instructions in briefing rooms where maps marked with approximate enemy positions were updated repeatedly. These maps relied heavily on code-breaking information that had indicated Midway as the target, giving American commanders confidence in their ability to position their forces ahead of the Japanese schedule. The pilots recognized that even slight variations in timing could determine whether their attack arrived before, during, or after a Japanese strike cycle. Each delay in launch risked placing them at a disadvantage, Yet rushing the preparations could compromise navigation or coordination with accompanying squadrons. The Japanese carriers, still maintaining regular operational patterns, issued commands to adjust scouting deployments while the fleet continued its advance. The calm sea assisted operations, but also reflected a certain stillness unusual for a major naval engagement. The carriers' movement created patterns of white wake that stood in stark contrast to the otherwise undisturbed surface, making them visible from altitude under favorable conditions. This visibility had the potential to compromise the fleet, but Japanese planners depended on the assumption that no American carrier group would be positioned close enough to take advantage of it. That assumption shaped both their confidence and their vulnerability. As the hours approached the decisive window, a convergence of factors developed simultaneously. American aircraft had begun launching in separate waves, each navigating toward general coordinates derived from intelligence assessments and faint reconnaissance reports. Some groups flew in search patterns that risked overextension, while others attempted more direct routes that depended heavily on estimated enemy positions. These formations would arrive at different times, creating staggered contact events that would impose pressure on Japanese defenses unevenly. Meanwhile, Japanese deck crews continued to rearm aircraft for potential anti-ship strikes, working against the tension created by incomplete reconnaissance information and debated strike priorities. By mid-morning, the Japanese carriers entered a period of operational exposure created by the alignment of their deck cycles. Aircraft recovered from the first midway strike were being refueled and rearmed, while additional planes waited for new launch orders. Fuel hoses, bomb carts, and armorers were positioned across the decks at the same time that enemy aircraft approached from varying directions. This combination produced a moment of maximum vulnerability, though it remained unrecognized by the Japanese command. Any delay in decision-making extended the period in which fully fueled and armed aircraft occupied the decks without the protection of imminent launch. In the sky, American torpedo squadrons approached at low altitude, navigating through challenging conditions that forced them to maintain steady bearing despite defensive fire. Their approach intersected with Japanese combat air patrols, drawing enemy fighters away from higher altitudes. The torpedo aircraft pressed forward despite heavy attrition, continuing their attack runs in ways that disrupted Japanese defensive patterns and contributed to the thinning of the fighter screen. This diversion would later prove significant, yet at this moment, its primary effect was to pull Japanese fighters into engagements at lower altitudes, inadvertently opening higher airspace. Above this contested lower airspace, American dive bomber formations moved through broken cloud layers, searching for visual confirmation of the Japanese carriers. Their approach benefited from the dispersal of Japanese fighters, though the pilots remained unaware of the full extent of the defensive weakening. The dive bombers navigated toward signs of enemy activity, relying on direction changes made in real time as they began to identify patterns of wakes and ship silhouettes. The visibility improved just enough to reveal the Japanese carriers positioned within striking distance, with wide flight decks occupied by aircraft, fueling equipment, and ordnance. The 5-minute window that would define the battle's outcome approached as these dive bombers descended from altitude. The Japanese carriers were aligned and exposed due to operational sequencing, incomplete reconnaissance, and earlier delays. The timing of the American arrival coincided precisely with the moment in which the Japanese flight decks were least prepared to defend against an incoming attack. The tension of the moment arose not from heightened dramatization, but from the stark operational conditions that placed both fleets on intersecting trajectories determined by timing, intelligence, and logistical constraints. The origins of the clash that culminated in the decisive minutes of June 4th, 1942, can be traced to strategic decisions formed in the months following the attack on Pearl Harbor. Japan's leadership sought a rapid expansion across the western and southwestern Pacific, aiming to secure a defensive perimeter wide enough to deter American counteroffensives. This strategy relied on the assumption that the United States, shocked by the initial blows, would require considerable time before recovering industrially and militarily. The Japanese Navy's operations during the first months of the Pacific War reflected confidence derived from earlier successes. Carrier-based air power had enabled rapid advances across the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies. These victories reinforced the view that Japan's strategic initiative could be extended deeper into the Central Pacific without encountering decisive resistance. The selection of Midway Atoll as a target emerged not from opportunistic expansion, but from structured planning within Japan's combined fleet. Senior naval commanders studied the geography and concluded that control of Midway would advance the operational perimeter to the edge of the Hawaiian archipelago. Its airfields, though limited in scale, would serve as both reconnaissance platforms and staging points, reducing pressure on Japanese forward bases and complicating American efforts to gather intelligence or launch raids. The island's relative isolation and small size suggested that it could be taken with manageable losses. For planners, it appeared to offer strategic leverage far greater than its physical dimensions implied. The development of the plan to seize Midway was influenced heavily by the analytical mindset of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. His assessment of American industrial capacity led him to conclude that Japan's only hope for a sustainable military position required inflicting a crippling blow early enough to discourage American persistence. Yamamoto believed that eliminating the U.S. Pacific Fleet's remaining carriers was a prerequisite for achieving this objective. The selection of Midway thus served a dual purpose. The island was a strategic target in its own right, and its threatened seizure would compel the U.S. carriers to intervene. The plan, formally designated Operation MI, was structured around this expectation. The origins of the confrontation were also shaped by the complex dynamics within Japan's naval leadership. While Yamamoto sought to draw American carriers into open battle, other senior officers believed continued advances into the South Pacific would better support Japan's defensive needs. The debate reflected broader disagreements about the long-term feasibility of prolonged conflict against a nation capable of sustained industrial mobilization. Ultimately, Yamamoto's influence prevailed, and Operation MI was authorized. Yet the internal debates left operational seams within the plan. These seams would later contribute to the division of forces and the dispersal of reconnaissance assets at a moment when concentrated effort might have been critical. At the same time, American codebreakers had been working steadily to interpret Japanese naval communications. Their efforts had accelerated after Pearl Harbor, driven by the urgency to understand Japanese intentions and to restore some measure of strategic balance. Analysts at Station Hypo in Hawaii detected patterns in Japanese message traffic that indicated a significant operation was being prepared. Through meticulous study of fragmentary intercepts, they identified AF as the likely designation for Midway. This conclusion was not reached abruptly, but through incremental verification, including a deliberate message sent from Midway reporting water shortages, which Japanese communications soon referenced indirectly. With this intelligence, American leadership recognized that the upcoming operation represented an opportunity as well as a threat. The surviving carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, were positioned to intercept the Japanese fleet. Admiral Chester Nimitz evaluated the intelligence assessments and concluded that a decisive engagement, though risky, was both necessary and unavoidable. The United States could ill afford to concede the Central Pacific, and allowing Midway to fall would give Japan strategic depth at a time when American naval power was still recovering. The decision to defend Midway with available carrier forces emerged from these calculations, rather than from any desire for rapid retaliation. The origins of the confrontation also involved the growing recognition within American leadership that future naval warfare would be defined by carrier air power rather than battleship engagements. Lessons from the Coral Sea battle, fought only weeks earlier, confirmed that carrier-based aircraft could deliver strategic effects disproportionate to the size of their platforms. The loss of Lexington and the damage to Yorktown demonstrated both the power and vulnerability of carrier operations. These experiences informed the American belief that identifying and striking the Japanese carriers before they could launch a coordinated attack would be essential for survival. The preparations leading to the Midway operation were therefore shaped by a commitment to intelligence-driven strategy and recognition of the significance of air superiority at sea. Meanwhile, Japanese planners sought to replicate the sweeping success of earlier operations by applying similar operational frameworks. Reconnaissance, strike coordination, and fleet movement patterns reflected established doctrine, which emphasized rapid offensive action, strict sequencing of carrier cycles, and reliance on well-coordinated air groups. These doctrinal strengths had contributed to Japan's early victories, but also introduced constraints. The system depended on uninterrupted initiative, accurate reconnaissance, and the ability to manage complex deck operations without external interference. The limitations of this approach became more pronounced as the distances involved in Operation MI stretched supply lines and reduced flexibility in responding to unexpected developments. The Japanese fleet's composition for the Midway operation reflected these ambitions. The 1st Carrier Striking Force, under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, formed the centerpiece of the operation, while supplementary forces supported potential landings and guarded against American intervention from other directions. The dispersal of these forces was intended to provide comprehensive coverage, but had the effect of diluting reconnaissance and reducing the ability to concentrate strength quickly. The origins of this dispersal traced back to Japan's broader expansion strategy, which assumed that multiple theaters required simultaneous support. As both sides advanced toward their eventual encounter, the influence of earlier decisions became increasingly visible. Japan's reliance on established doctrine and assumptions about American weakness shaped the design of Operation MI. The United States, informed by code-breaking successes and growing experience in carrier operations, crafted its defensive response with careful attention to timing and positioning. The convergence of these two approaches set the stage for a confrontation in which information, operational tempo, and logistical precision would determine the outcome. Far from emerging suddenly, the decisive minutes of June 4 these were the culmination of months of preparation, debate, intelligence gathering, and strategic calculation. Each command decision, each piece of reconnaissance, and each logistical measure from both sides contributed to the conditions under which the carriers would meet. The origins of the confrontation lay not in a single moment, but in the layered structure of decisions stretching back to the earliest phases of the war. These decisions, shaped by both strength and miscalculation, created the framework within which the brief critical interval would occur. The shock created by the events of June 4, 1942, did not arise solely from the physical destruction of major fleet units. It emerged from the abrupt rupture of Japanese strategic expectations that had developed over years of naval training, decades of doctrinal refinement, and months of successful wartime expansion. The Imperial Japanese Navy entered the Midway operation with a sense of operational continuity, assuming that its carrier forces, experienced air groups, and proven tactics would continue to produce results similar to those achieved during the first half year of the Pacific War. The sudden shift in momentum that occurred within a span of minutes contradicted these expectations, with a force that reverberated through every level of Japan's military hierarchy. Prior to Midway, Japanese operational planning had been built on assumptions validated by repeated success. Carrier groups had demonstrated the ability to coordinate long-range strikes with precision. Japanese naval aviation crews were seasoned from extensive pre-war training, and their aircraft, the A-6M-0, the D-3A dive bomber, and the B-5N torpedo plane, had proven effective in multiple theaters. Commanders relied on doctrinal patterns emphasizing rapid offensive pressure, coordinated waves of attack, and decisive carrier engagements. These patterns produced a confidence that future operations would follow similar trajectories. The unexpected American attack cut directly against this confidence, presenting a scenario that Japanese planners considered unlikely. The shock was intensified by the timing of the American arrival. The dive bombers reached the Japanese carriers precisely during the interval when flight decks were crowded with fueled and armed aircraft preparing for a strike. This moment of vulnerability was known within naval doctrine, yet it was understood to be temporary and manageable under the assumption that scouting and defensive measures would prevent an enemy from achieving surprise at such a critical time. The fact that the American strike penetrated this interval suggested a failure not of a single element, but of the broader system that governed Japanese carrier operations. The fleet had relied on timed cycles in which reconnaissance, rearming, and launch procedures aligned with operational expectations. The American attack demonstrated that adherence to these cycles without adaptive flexibility could create significant exposure. The shock also stemmed from the contradiction between Japanese expectations of American capabilities and the reality revealed during the battle. Prior to Midway, Japan viewed the U.S. Navy as recovering from severe losses. The damage inflicted at Pearl Harbor removed battleships from the immediate strategic equation, while the sinking of Lexington and the damage to Yorktown at Coral Sea seemed to indicate that American carrier strength had been diminished. Japanese assessments predicted that any American carrier counterattack would be limited in scale, poorly coordinated, or delayed. This view underestimated both American industrial resilience and the effectiveness of U.S. intelligence efforts. When American carriers not only appeared in force, but did so at a tactically decisive moment, it challenged pre-existing assumptions about how quickly the United States could respond. The shock was further compounded by the rapid collapse of defensive cohesion aboard the Japanese carriers. Combat air patrols were positioned at low altitude due to earlier engagements with American torpedo planes, leaving upper airspace inadequately defended. The defensive framework, designed to protect the carriers through layered interception, became stretched as pilots were diverted to counter threats arriving from varying directions. The arrival of high-altitude dive bombers during this period revealed that the defensive system, though structured and drilled, could be overwhelmed by multiple incoming threats not aligned with expected patterns. The resulting inability to intercept the dive bombers effectively contributed significantly to the sudden loss of the carriers. Command decisions played a central role in the experience of shock. Vice Admiral Nagumo faced a sequence of conflicting intelligence reports and operational pressures that required rapid adjustments. These pressures forced decisions about whether to rearm aircraft for a second strike on Midway, maintain readiness for anti-ship operations, or delay flight cycles until more consistent reconnaissance information became available. The indecision created by these conflicting demands lengthened the period during which flight decks remained cluttered and vulnerable. When the American attack arrived during this interval, it exposed the consequences of decision-making that relied on incomplete or contradictory information. The speed with which the situation deteriorated magnified the psychological impact on the command staff, whose expectations of operational control were abruptly replaced by a crisis that rendered defensive measures ineffective. The structural shock extended beyond the immediate battle to the broader strategic environment. Japan had entered the Midway operation with the expectation that its carrier fleet represented a decisive asset capable of shaping the trajectory of the war. The sudden loss of multiple carriers created a strategic vacuum that Japan was not prepared to fill quickly. The industrial limitations of Japan's wartime economy meant that replacement carriers could not be produced at a rate comparable to American shipbuilding. Additionally, the loss of experienced aviators and deck crews could not be easily remedied. Training programs within Japan's naval aviation structure were not designed to generate replacements for mass casualties, as the doctrine had emphasized maintaining elite groups rather than expanding capacity. The destruction inflicted during those critical minutes at Midway therefore represented not only the loss of physical ships, but the collapse of a trained cohort essential to Japan's strike capability. On a psychological level, the shock radiated throughout the Imperial Japanese Navy, influencing morale, planning expectations, and the broader sense of strategic momentum. The fleet that had once operated with confidence now faced uncertainty about its ability to regain initiative. The sudden defeat challenged foundational assumptions regarding the reliability of Japanese reconnaissance, the invulnerability of doctrinal timing, and the perceived inability of the United States to mount an effective counteroffensive. These challenges contributed to a broader reconsideration of strategy, though initial attempts to restore momentum often relied on the same operational principles that had failed at Midway. The influence of the shock also reached Japan's political leadership. The Imperial General Headquarters, accustomed to receiving reports of sweeping successes, had difficulty reconciling the scale and speed of the carrier losses with prior assessments. The sudden reversal forced reconsideration of ongoing operations in the Indian Ocean, the South Pacific, and the Aleutians. Although Japan continued to pursue further objectives in these regions, the confidence that had characterized earlier expansions was replaced by caution, shaped by the recognition that the United States possessed greater resilience than previously assumed. Furthermore, the shock disrupted Japan's strategic timetable. The careful balance between expansion, consolidation, and defense, already strained by the vastness of the territories occupied, now faced accelerated American counterpressure. Midway altered the rate at which Japan would encounter increasingly capable American forces. The battle served as a key inflection point in which Japanese momentum was replaced by reactive planning, constrained by the losses suffered during those crucial minutes. Ultimately, the shock of Midway lay in the sudden transition from sustained operational success to irreversible setback. The events of June 4th did not merely shift the course of an individual battle, they revealed the fragility of a strategy built on assumptions that no longer aligned with the operational reality. The speed with which the carriers were lost, combined with the broader implications for naval aviation and strategic planning, created a moment of clarity that exposed the limits of Japan's wartime approach. This realization would shape all subsequent Japanese naval operations, embedding Midway's shock deeply into the fabric of the conflict. The surviving documents that outline the decision-making processes on June 4, 1942, present a detailed picture of the pressures shaping the actions of both Japanese and American commanders. Logs, signals, operational planning files, and post-action summaries reveal a sequence of judgments made under conditions of incomplete information, constrained communication, and rapidly evolving operational demands. Rather than depicting isolated errors or singular moments of misinterpretation, these records show a structured pattern in which each choice was conditioned by the larger strategic assumptions held by both navies. The operational record of the Japanese 1st Carrier Striking Force begins with the orders issued before dawn. Flagship logs detailed the directive to launch the first strike against Midway's defenses, consistent with the mission plan that prioritized neutralizing the island's airfields before committing to any engagement with American naval forces. These documents note accurate timing, disciplined deck handling, and clearly defined strike sequencing. The reports emphasize the expectation that reconnaissance would confirm enemy fleet positions early in the day. When the first wave returned, debriefing notes indicated that while defensive installations on Midway were damaged, they remained functional. Messages sent to Nagumo's staff reflected uncertainty about whether these results justified an immediate second strike. Reconnaissance dispatches provide insight into the limitations faced by the Japanese command. The operational plan relied on a series of search arcs flown by float planes and long-range scouts. However, the records showed that some aircraft assigned to these arcs were delayed or launched late due to mechanical issues or reassignment to earlier operations. Log entries from Tone's scout plane, which eventually spotted an American presence, record delayed launch times and incomplete initial contact descriptions. The wording of the first messages indicated sightings of ships without clear identification, prompting follow-up inquiries that consume minutes during which operational timelines continued to advance. These exchanges reveal how command decisions were shaped by short, fragmented messages that left room for interpretation. Admiral Nagumo's staff logs reflect the tension created by conflicting operational priorities. One series of notebook entries documents the debate over rearming aircraft for anti-ship operations. Initially, many aircraft had been prepared with ordnance suitable for a follow-up strike on Midway. When reports indicated the presence of enemy ships, orders were issued to shift ordnance to torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs. Shortly thereafter, additional uncertainty within reconnaissance reports led to reconsideration of this reconfiguration. The logs show these reversals occurring rapidly, with deck crews forced to halt and restart ordnance changes under significant time pressure. The written records of these orders illustrate how operational doctrine collided with the realities of limited intelligence. American records from the same period demonstrate a markedly different information environment. Communications among U.S. carrier commanders show reliance on pre-battle intelligence derived from the code-breaking rather than on-the-spot reconnaissance. Messages exchanged between Enterprise and Hornet reflect confidence that Japanese carriers would be located in the general area predicted by analysts at Pearl Harbor. Flight plans prepared for the morning launch show that the American commanders were prepared to send strike groups along predetermined bearings, adjusting courses as new information emerged. Logs from Yorktown reflect additional caution, as the carrier had only recently been repaired and rejoined the fleet. Yet these records also show coordination consistent with a clear understanding of Japanese operational patterns. Intercept stations during the battle contributed supplementary reports, though these were often coarse and lacked precise positional detail. Records from Midway's defense forces describe attempts to provide situational updates, despite damaged infrastructure and limited radio capability. The documentation indicates that American commanders received fragmented but reasonably timely reports that Japanese forces had commenced their air assault on the island, confirming the accuracy of code-breaking assessments and reinforcing expectations of where the Japanese fleet would be located. This alignment between pre-battle intelligence and field observations formed the basis for decisive American command decisions. One of the most revealing sets of documents comes from the recorded decisions made aboard Yorktown. Operations logs note the quick reaction to contact reports indicating approaching Japanese aircraft. Commanders authorized the launch of combat air patrols and began maneuvering the carrier into a defensive posture, reflecting experience gained from Coral Sea. The record of these actions shows a disciplined response consistent with established American doctrine for mitigating the threat from incoming dive bombers and torpedo planes. After Yorktown was struck, damage control logs show structured attempts to contain flooding and maintain operational capability, documenting the procedures that temporarily kept the ship functional and allowed it to launch and recover aircraft even after sustaining significant damage. Japanese post-battle analyses, recorded in official reports and surviving correspondence, provide additional insight into command decisions during the critical minutes of the battle. Officers surveyed the remains of the planning process, noting that the decision to maintain flexibility for a second strike on Midway had extended preparation times and contributed to the presence of fuel hoses and ordnance on the flight decks during the American attack. Reports also reflect concerns about the dispersal of Japanese forces across a wide operational area, pointing to insufficient coordination between scouting assets and the main strike force. These assessments highlight how the broader operational structure influenced the decision-making environment aboard the carriers. The depth of surviving documentation allows historians to reconstruct the moment-to-moment pressures faced by commanders. Flight deck operation logs record aircraft movements at precise intervals, illustrating the demanding sequence of actions required to launch or recover large numbers of planes under combat conditions. Each aircraft's preparation status, fueling, arming, positioning, was documented in standardized format, revealing how the interruptions created by changing orders increased congestion on the decks and extended exposure times. These operational logs form one of the clearest pieces of evidence linking doctrinal inflexibility to tactical vulnerability. American after-action reports provide detailed accounts of command coordination during the attack. Reports from Enterprise's dive bomber group describe the decision to adjust heading based on observed ship wakes rather than relying solely on earlier contact reports. These decisions, preserved in squadron-level logs and debriefing notes, demonstrate how flexibility among aviators allowed them to compensate for earlier navigational errors or misalignments between strike groups. Other records describe the timing of dives, the selection of targets, and the assessment of Japanese deck conditions. These observations contributed to an understanding of how precise timing enabled the destruction of multiple carriers in rapid succession. Japanese command diaries, though incomplete due to wartime losses, document the shock experienced at the moment of the American attack. Entries note the sudden appearance of enemy aircraft at high altitude, and the rapid sequence in which near-simultaneous impacts were reported aboard Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. Surviving officers recorded the difficulty of issuing coherent defensive orders once the carriers were struck, as communications equipment and command posts sustained heavy damage. These records offer a clear view of how command structures, dependent on centralized decision-making, were disrupted within minutes. Together, these documents reveal a complex portrait of a battle shaped by doctrine, intelligence, orchestration, and the limitations inherent in wartime communication. The command decisions recorded on June 4, 1942, were not isolated, but part of an interconnected chain influenced by strategic assumptions, operational constraints, and real-time observations. The preserved logs and reports show that the decisive 5 minutes emerged from intersecting decisions documented in detail across both fleets, providing a factual foundation for understanding how the brief interval reshaped the course of the war. The progression toward the critical minutes of June 4, 1942 developed through a series of escalating pressures that gradually narrowed the Japanese carrier's margin for operational safety. Each incremental development, reconnaissance delays, shifting strike priorities, and unexpected American resistance, added weight to decisions already constrained by doctrine and limited intelligence. The event did not emerge abruptly. It formed through an accumulation of circumstances that pushed the first carrier striking force into a position from which recovery would be impossible. The first significant escalation occurred when the initial attack on Midway failed to neutralize the island's defensive capabilities. Reports from returning pilots indicated that while fuel tanks, hangars, and installations had been hit, the airfield remained functional. These reports challenged initial planning assumptions that a single strike would render the island incapable of meaningful retaliation. This created a dilemma. The original plan relied on destroying Midway's defenses quickly enough to allow the carriers to shift focus toward engaging the American fleet. When the initial strike did not achieve this objective, Japanese commanders faced the pressure of deciding whether to commit to a second strike or conserve resources for potential fleet action. This uncertainty was magnified by the incomplete reconnaissance picture. Long-range scouting planes, tasked with providing early detection of enemy carriers, were late in launching or assigned modified search arcs due to earlier operational demands. The plane that eventually discovered elements of the American fleet reported the sighting with insufficient clarity. The message, indicating the presence of enemy ships, lacked immediate identification and left open the possibility that the vessels observed were cruisers or destroyers rather than carriers. Naval doctrine required confirmation before committing fully to an anti-ship strike, but each minute spent waiting for clarification increased exposure on the flight decks. As Japanese commanders deliberated, the operational tempo continued to accelerate. Aircraft returning from the Midway strike required refueling, rearming, and repositioning. These procedures were normally carried out in a controlled sequence, but the pressure of uncertain intelligence forced alterations to the timing. The process of switching ordnance loads, removing weapons intended for land attack, and replacing them with torpedoes or armor-piercing bombs interrupted the standard deck cycle. Fuel lines remained connected longer than expected. An aircraft arranged for the original strike configuration had to be moved or repositioned. Every shift created new layers of congestion on the decks. The situation escalated further as American aircraft from Midway launched successive attacks. Though these attacks inflicted no significant damage, they disrupted Japanese air defenses and diverted attention from flight deck operations. Combat air patrols were forced to engage incoming planes, arriving at irregular intervals and varying altitudes. Each interception created gaps in the defensive perimeter and consumed fuel and ammunition at a pace faster than predicted. The need to recover, refuel, and relaunch defending fighters added another layer of complexity to a process already strained by rearming efforts. The decision to order a second strike on Midway intensified the burden on deck crews. Logs indicate that rearmament efforts were well underway when reconnaissance reports suggested the presence of enemy ships. This created a conflict between operational imperatives, maintaining pressure on Midway's defenses or preparing for anti-ship action. The decision to reverse the earlier rearmament order placed deck crews under extreme time pressure. Ammunition had to be removed, resorted, and replaced. Some aircraft had to be moved again, disrupting the careful sequencing required for efficient carrier operations. This reversal is documented in multiple records as one of the key contributors to the growing vulnerability of the Japanese carriers. Meanwhile, American forces were experiencing their own escalation. Aircraft launched from Enterprise and Hornet began searching for the Japanese fleet. The routes taken by these strike groups varied, with some squadrons flying too far north, others adjusting headings based on limited observations, and several torpedo squadrons approaching in fragmented waves. These approaches increased the likelihood that American planes would arrive at separate times, rather than as a unified force. Although this lack of coordination might have weakened the attack under other circumstances, it imposed sustained pressure on Japanese defenders, drawing fighters away from higher altitudes and contributing to the dispersion of the combat air patrol. The arrival of the first American torpedo squadrons marked another escalation. Flying at low altitude and vulnerable to interception, these aircraft approached without the benefit of fighter escort. Japanese fighters engaged them aggressively, and the torpedo planes suffered severe losses. Yet their attacks diverted Japanese attention and contributed to the downward pull of defensive resources. The engagement forced Japanese KAP pilots to descend into sustained low-altitude combat, consuming fuel and disrupting the altitude-based structure that normally protected the carriers from dive bomber threats. Simultaneously, the American carriers continued to launch additional waves of aircraft. Dive bomber squadrons, delayed by navigational challenges and cloud cover, approached the combat zone later than the torpedo planes. Their delayed arrival aligned precisely with the moment when Japanese carriers were at their most vulnerable. This convergence was not planned with precision, yet it emerged from a combination of determined search efforts, partial intelligence, and the prolonged defensive engagements that had drawn Japanese fighters away from upper airspace. The Japanese carriers were further constrained by the cumulative effect of earlier decisions. The need to recover aircraft returning from defensive patrols and reconnaissance missions added to the congestion on the decks. Fuel reserves had to be managed carefully to sustain ongoing operations. As each new factor compounded the previous ones, the margin for error narrowed. By the time the American dive bombers arrived overhead, the Japanese carriers were caught in a sequence of operational deficiencies that had escalated to a point of critical vulnerability. On the command level, the escalation contributed to a disruptive environment in which decisions were made under increasingly compressed timelines. Nagumo's staff faced the challenge of integrating new reconnaissance reports with the demands of deck operations while maintaining readiness for multiple simultaneous threats. Logs show that the staff attempted to reconcile conflicting information, but the speed of incoming reports forced decisions based on incomplete data. This created a situation in which operational flexibility was increasingly limited, and each new choice carried greater risk. The escalation reached its peak in the moments immediately before the American dive bombers appeared. Flight decks across the Japanese carriers held aircraft with varying ordnance states, some fully fueled, others partially rearmed, and several positioned for immediate launch. Fuel hoses and bomb carts remained across the decks. Defensive fighters were dispersed and engaged at lower altitudes. Command staffs were focused on preparing for the next phase of operations, rather than anticipating an imminent high-altitude attack. In this environment of mounting pressures, the Japanese carriers entered the 5-minute interval that would shape the outcome of the battle. The momentum toward catastrophe had been building for hours, shaped by decisions rooted in doctrine, intelligence limitations, and operational necessity. The decisive moment emerged not from sudden failure, but from the cumulative effect of escalating conditions that left the carriers exposed at the exact time the American dive bombers reached attack position. The confrontation at Midway was shaped by the composition, experience, and limitations of the forces deployed by both Japan and the United States. The capabilities of the fleets and the decisions of commanders on each side formed the framework within which the decisive 5-minute interval unfolded. These elements did not operate in isolation. They intersected through doctrine, operational tempo, and the technical characteristics of the ships and aircraft placed under their control. Understanding the forces at play requires examining the strategic cultures that guided each navy, the condition of their carrier groups, and the constraints that framed their choices on June 4, 1942. The Japanese 1st Carrier Striking Force, under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, represented the central offensive arm of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Its 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, constituted an elite formation that had executed operations across the Pacific with precision. Their air groups, built from seasoned aviators trained in rigorous pre-war programs, were considered among the most skilled in the world. The carriers themselves were the product of Japan's commitment to naval aviation as a decisive element of maritime strategy. Each had undergone refits and modifications intended to improve strike capacity, though their designs retained vulnerabilities associated with the placement of hangars, fuel distribution systems, and ordnance storage. Nagumo's role within this structure was defined by strict doctrine. The 1st Carrier Striking Force operated according to centralized command principles, emphasizing coordinated waves of attack and careful management of carrier flight decks. Doctrine required aircraft to be armed and prepared based on accurate reconnaissance assessments, contributing to the need for clear, reliable intelligence. Nagumo himself was a capable officer, experienced in carrier operations, but oriented toward methodical sequencing rather than rapid improvisation. His ability to influence events during the critical period was limited by the structural constraints imposed by doctrine and the rapid pace of unfolding events. Supporting Nagumo's carriers were cruisers and destroyers, providing anti-aircraft and anti-submarine protection. These ships were highly trained in screening tactics, but were limited in their capacity to defend against high-altitude dive-bombing attacks. Their anti-aircraft armament was adequate for engagements against slower or less coordinated adversaries, but less suited to countering sudden, well-executed dives from altitude. The disposition of these escorts reflected Japanese expectations regarding the timing and nature of American counterattacks, emphasizing protection against torpedo attacks and low-flying bombers rather than steep-approach dive bombers arriving at the moment of maximum vulnerability. The Japanese air groups formed a second critical component. The A6AIM-0 fighters provided range, maneuverability, and excellent performance at lower and mid-altitudes. However, their effectiveness depended on altitude advantage and coordinated vectoring from carrier control staffs. The additional aircraft, the D-3A dive bombers and B-5N torpedo planes, formed the core of Japanese offensive capability. Their effectiveness had been demonstrated repeatedly in earlier campaigns, but their rearmament requirements created logistical challenges when orders shifted abruptly. These logistical demands, combined with the constraints of deck space and the number of fueling lines available, shaped the carrier's operational vulnerability during the critical minutes of June 4th. On the American side, the three carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the recently repaired Yorktown, formed Task Forces 16 and 17 under Admirals Raymond Spruance and Frank Jack Fletcher. Although American naval aviation was not as experienced as its Japanese counterpart, it possessed significant advantages in terms of coordination, intelligence support, and adaptability. The advancement of code-breaking efforts gave American commanders clarity regarding Japanese intentions and allowed them to operate from positions of informed anticipation rather than reaction. This intelligence advantage played a central role in shaping the deployment and approach of American forces. Enterprise and Hornet carried air groups with varied levels of experience. While some squadrons contained aviators who had trained extensively before the war, others included relatively inexperienced pilots who had only recently joined operational units. Despite these uneven backgrounds, American air groups operated within a command framework that emphasized independent initiative and flexibility. This allowed dive bomber formations to make real-time decisions based on observed conditions, rather than waiting for explicit direction from carrier command staffs. Yorktown represented a unique asset. Damaged at Coral Sea only weeks earlier, it had undergone accelerated repairs that restored it to operational status. Its presence at Midway was not anticipated by Japanese planners, who believed that Yorktown remained out of service. The ship carried a reorganized composite air group, combining elements from its own squadrons and those from other carriers. The result was a force that, though not perfectly coordinated, was capable of launching multiple layered attacks. Yorktown's command structure demonstrated the capacity to manage damage control and air operations simultaneously, a capability that would prove essential during the battle. The American carrier commanders operated within a more decentralized structure than their Japanese counterparts. Fletcher held overall tactical command, but Spruance, commanding Task Force 16, executed operational decisions for the launch of the primary strike groups. This division of authority reflected both necessity and doctrine. Fletcher, aboard Yorktown, had to weigh the risks of exposing his damaged carrier to early detection. Spruance, aboard Enterprise, could focus on launching strikes based on known Japanese positions. Their records show a high degree of trust in intelligence estimates, as well as a willingness to commit forces without perfect reconnaissance. The surface ships accompanying the American carriers also played essential roles. Cruisers and destroyers formed protective screens similar to those used by the Japanese fleet, but they benefited from more advanced radar systems that improved early warning capabilities. However, radar could not fully compensate for the complexity of coordinating defensive measures during multi-vector attacks. The American escort's primary contribution to the decisive moments came not from anti-aircraft fire, but from maneuvering with the carriers to mitigate the effects of incoming strikes and to recover returning aircraft under difficult conditions. Both fleets faced operational constraints that shaped their behavior. The Japanese fleet operated with experience, doctrine, and striking power, but lacked flexibility in adapting deck cycles under changing conditions. The American fleet operated with intelligence advantages, decentralized initiative, and resilience, but faced disadvantages in experience and aircraft performance. The convergence of these capabilities and limitations created a dynamic in which both sides sought to achieve decisive advantage through timing, positioning, and reconnaissance. The human dimension within these forces also played a critical role. Japanese aircrew were highly trained, but operated within a rigid system that expected synchronized actions and predictable sequencing. Their effectiveness depended on the integrity of the system as a whole. American aviators operated in smaller, more fragmented formations, requiring individual leaders at the squadron and flight level to make decisions independently. This created opportunities for adaptation that would later prove decisive. The forces at play on June 4th thus consisted not only of ships and aircraft, but of doctrines, assumptions, skills, and constraints that define the operational environment. Each carrier, each commander, and each squadron entered the battle shaped by the strategic culture of their navy. When the decisive moment arrived, these underlying factors determined how each side reacted and how the battle unfolded within the narrow interval that would redefine the course of the Pacific War. The path to the decisive 5-minute interval was shaped by operational choices that determined timing, exposure, and the alignment of forces in the Central Pacific. These decisions, made across multiple levels of command, involved assessments of reconnaissance reports, management of carrier flight cycles, and the integration of doctrine with real-time developments. The choices did not emerge from improvisation alone. They reflected the structural logic of each navy's approach to carrier warfare. Their cumulative effect narrowed the possibilities for both sides, ultimately creating conditions in which a brief interval would determine the outcome of the battle. One of the most influential operational choices occurred when Japanese commanders decided to recover the 1st Midway Strike Group before launching any anti-ship operations. This choice was consistent with established doctrine, which emphasized maintaining a unified air group and launching major waves in coordinated fashion, rather than dispatching fragmented or partially prepared forces. Recovery of the strike aircraft required clearing the flight decks, positioning crews to receive incoming planes, and temporarily halting rearming operations. This sequence consumed valuable minutes and complicated subsequent decisions. The choice was rational within the established framework, but carried unintended consequences when enemy carriers were detected during the recovery window. The decision to replenish and reorganize aircraft aboard the Japanese carriers further shaped the subsequent vulnerability. Once the returning strike group had landed, crews moved quickly to refuel and rearm the aircraft. The Japanese system of fuel distribution required hoses to be moved across the decks and routed through hangar spaces in ways that created operational bottlenecks. When commanders ordered a shift from land attack ordnance to anti-ship loadouts, the need to remove unused weapons, reposition carts, and secure ordnance further extended the period during which the carriers were exposed. Each step was performed efficiently by crews trained for such tasks, yet the cumulative effect prolonged the interval in which the carriers were not prepared to launch defensive or offensive operations. Another critical choice involved the management of reconnaissance. Japanese planning depended heavily on accurate scouting reports to determine the presence and location of American carriers. The decision to assign limited reconnaissance aircraft to the search arcs around Midway reflected the assumption that American forces would not be close enough to threaten the fleet during the early phases of the operation. When reconnaissance reports finally indicated the presence of American ships, the message lacked immediate clarity regarding ship type. Nagumo's staff was forced to request additional confirmation, delaying the decision to commit aircraft to an anti-ship strike. The choice to wait for confirmation aligned with doctrinal expectations, yet it reduced the time available to respond effectively. The American decision to launch strike groups early, even without precise knowledge of Japanese carrier positions, represented a contrasting approach. This choice was informed by confidence in intelligence assessments and the urgency to seize initiative. Spruance and Fletcher understood that delaying launch until perfect reconnaissance could be attained risked encountering the Japanese fleet too late to influence the next carrier cycle. By launching early, they ensured that American aircraft were already in the air searching for the Japanese carriers at the time when Japanese decks were most vulnerable. The choice carried risks, including potential fuel exhaustion and loss of aircraft, but its ultimate effect was to place American strike forces in the right position at the right moment. A further American decision that proved critical involved allowing squadron leaders to adjust headings independently based on emerging observations. This decentralized approach permitted adaptations that compensated for earlier navigational challenges. While the torpedo squadrons approached inefficiently and suffered heavy losses, the dive bomber units benefited from the absence of stringent directional constraints. Their ability to alter course based on the sighting of ship wakes enabled them to converge on the Japanese carriers during the interval of maximum exposure. This operational flexibility stood in contrast to the rigid sequencing of Japanese carrier doctrine. When American torpedo squadrons began their attacks, another critical choice emerged on the Japanese side. Japanese fighter pilots, trained to intercept threats sequentially and with altitude advantage, engaged the low-flying torpedo bombers with determination. The choice to focus on these attackers, though understandable given their immediate threat, pulled the combat air patrol into extended engagements that consumed time, altitude, and fuel. This decision, shaped by the demands of real-time defense, contributed to insufficient fighter presence at higher altitudes when the American dive bombers arrived. The Japanese defensive system, optimized for layered responses, became unbalanced through necessity rather than planning. The Japanese decision to maintain tight carrier formation also influenced the outcome. Operating in close formation allowed for coordinated defensive fire and simplified command communication. However, tight formation also made the carriers more visible, once discovered, and facilitated the ability of the attacking dive bombers to select targets quickly. The concentration of ships in a confined area increased the effectiveness of a well-executed dive bombing attack, enabling multiple carriers to be struck in a short interval. This structural choice, rooted in doctrine, unintentionally amplified the consequences of being caught during a vulnerable deck cycle. On Yorktown, American commanders made decisions that further shaped the dynamics of the battle. After receiving initial contact reports suggesting an incoming Japanese strike, the ship maneuvered to reduce the predictability of its course. This maneuvering complicated Japanese attack runs and created a moving defense that required attackers to adjust during their approach. When Yorktown was struck by bombs and temporarily disabled, damage control personnel made the decision to restore operational capacity rapidly, allowing the carrier to rejoin the battle sooner than Japanese planners believed possible. This contributed to the perception among Japanese aviators that they had encountered more than one American carrier, influencing subsequent decisions by Hiryu to allocate multiple strike waves. Perhaps the most decisive operational choice was made by the dive bomber leaders aboard Enterprise. Upon reaching an area where they anticipated finding the Japanese carriers, but seeing only empty ocean, they searched for indications of fleet movement rather than turning back. When they identified ship wakes radiating across the surface, they followed these patterns until the Japanese carriers came into view. This decision-building process, based not on orders but on observation, proved instrumental in positioning the American dive bombers at the precise altitude and bearing required to initiate the attacks that would decide the battle. These operational choices, taken together, shaped the conditions that culminated in the decisive 5-minute window. They reflected the structural differences between the two navies: Japan's reliance on coordinated doctrine and centralized command, and America's use of intelligence-driven strategy combined with decentralized execution. Each decision was rational within its own framework, yet their cumulative effect determined which fleet would maintain operational initiative. The historical record of the decisive minutes at Midway contains gaps, contradictions, and areas of incomplete clarity that complicate efforts to reconstruct events with absolute precision. These uncertainties do not obscure the broader outcome, but they influence the interpretation of how specific actions unfolded when decisions were made, and why certain maneuvers occurred at particular moments. The complexity arises from damaged documents, conflicting eyewitness accounts, rapid sequences of events, and the inherent limitations of wartime communication. Understanding these complications provides insight into the difficulty of assigning exact causality within an event shaped by overlapping timelines and simultaneous actions. One of the most debated uncertainties concerns the precise timing of Japanese rearmament orders aboard the carriers. Existing logs provide partial information, but many flight deck entries were lost during or after the battle. Surviving Japanese records indicate that an order was given to rearm aircraft for anti-ship operations after reconnaissance reports suggested enemy vessels had been sighted. A subsequent modification of that order, calling for a return to land attack configuration or a temporary halt, is mentioned in officer testimonies but appears inconsistently in formal records. These discrepancies have led to differing interpretations of how far along the rearming process progressed by the time American aircraft appeared. A related uncertainty involves the exact placement of aircraft on Japanese flight decks at the moment the American dive bombers arrived. Some accounts suggest that aircraft were lined up for imminent launch, while others indicate that many were still in the hangars or positioned in congested clusters awaiting refueling or ordnance changes. The limited photographic evidence and incomplete surviving logs make it difficult to determine the precise readiness state of each carrier. This ambiguity affects assessments of how vulnerable the carriers were due to exposed fuel lines, ordnance carts, or the arrangement of parked aircraft. The timing and content of reconnaissance messages form another area of complexity. The initial sighting report from Tone's scout aircraft has been preserved, but the sequence of follow-up messages contains inconsistencies. The scout's first message indicated the presence of enemy ships, but the identification of a carrier was delayed. Researchers continue to debate whether this delay resulted from transmission issues, message drafting, or a reconnaissance angle that prevented immediate identification. Japanese officers later offered differing explanations, some attributing the delay to radio interference, others to cautious reporting protocols. These discrepancies complicate assessments of how quickly Nagumo received the information needed to make strategic decisions. The exact flight paths taken by American dive bomber squadrons also contain elements of uncertainty. Although squadron logs describe general routes and bearings, the pilots' recollections sometimes differ regarding specific course adjustments. Some aviators reported turning south after failing to find the Japanese fleet along the expected bearing, while others described following ship wakes spotted through breaks in cloud cover. These variations reflect both the difficulty of navigation at altitude in scattered cloud conditions and the challenges of reconstructing memory after intense combat. The uncertainties influence the interpretation of how the dive bombers achieved their timely arrival over the Japanese carriers. The altitude distribution of Japanese combat air patrol fighters represents another area of ambiguity. While records confirm that many fighters had been drawn to low altitude by earlier torpedo plane attacks, the precise number of fighters still operating at mid or high altitude when the dive bombers arrived remains unclear. Some American accounts describe minimal resistance during their final approach, while Japanese reports indicate that multiple fighters attempted to intercept the attackers but arrived too late. Damage to Japanese carriers and the loss of many personnel during the attack hindered post-battle reconstruction of fighter positioning, contributing to the uncertainty surrounding defensive readiness. Even the exact minute-by-minute sequence of bomb impacts contains points of debate. American dive bomber squadrons released their bombs in rapid succession, and the carriers were struck within a narrow window of time. However, the specific order in which Akagi, Keiga, and Soryu were hit varies across surviving accounts. Some records suggest that Keiga sustained the first successful hits, while others point to Soryu receiving initial damage. The confusion is understandable given the chaotic environment and the simultaneous arrival of multiple dive bomber groups. This ambiguity influences detailed reconstructions of the attack, but does not alter the larger conclusion that the carriers were struck almost simultaneously. Japanese internal communication during the attack introduces additional uncertainties. Many command stations were destroyed within minutes, and survivors provided incomplete or conflicting recollections of the final orders issued. Some officers reported receiving instructions to prepare for counterattacks, while others recalled directives to focus exclusively on damage control. The speed at which fire, smoke, and structural damage spread made coherent communication difficult, and the loss of command personnel further complicated the chain of recollection. These inconsistencies highlight the limits of reconstructing precise command decisions during a rapidly deteriorating situation. A more subtle uncertainty arises from the interpretation of American decision-making aboard Enterprise and Hornet. While operational logs provide a clear overview of launch orders and squadron coordination, some internal deliberations remain undocumented. The precise reasoning behind certain course corrections, fuel assessments, and adjustments to squadron sequencing relies partly on pilot debriefings that contain variations in detail. Different squadron leaders remembered the contributing factors differently, and post-war accounts sometimes reflected interpretations shaped by hindsight rather than preserved operational notes. The nature of cloud cover and visibility on the morning of June 4th also contributes to the complexity of reconstructing events. Meteorological records indicate variable cloud layers at different altitudes, with scattered formations that opened intermittently. Pilots describe seeing the carriers suddenly appear through gaps in the clouds, yet their descriptions differ slightly regarding cloud height and density. These inconsistencies are understandable given the dynamic conditions, but they complicate precise mapping of approach paths and the visual cues used by aviators to locate the Japanese fleet. The uncertainties extend to the Japanese understanding of American carrier strength. Japanese records indicate varying estimates of the number of American carriers present. Some Japanese pilots believed they attacked 2 or 3 different carriers during their retaliatory strikes, influenced by Yorktown's repeated recovery from damage and quick restoration of operational capability. These misidentifications contributed to confusion within Japanese command staffs and influenced subsequent tactical decisions. The lack of clarity regarding enemy strength shaped Japanese actions even as their carriers suffered catastrophic losses. Finally, the sequence by which fires spread aboard the Japanese carriers remains partly unclear. Damage control records for Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were either destroyed with the ships or preserved only in fragmented form. Testimonies from surviving crew members provide partial insights into how fires propagated across decks and into hangar spaces, but these accounts differ in detail. Some officers attributed rapid fire spread to ruptured fuel lines, while others emphasized the presence of volatile ordnance left exposed by interrupted rearming. These disparities prevent a fully precise reconstruction of the internal progression of damage within each carrier. Despite these uncertainties, the overall trajectory of the battle remains well established. The ambiguities reflect the limitations inherent in reconstructing fast-paced, multi-layered engagements conducted under extreme pressure. They also illustrate how small variations in recollection or recording can create gaps in the historical record, even within events whose outcomes are fully documented. These complexities underscore the difficulty of tracing every detail of the 5-minute interval that reshaped the Pacific War, highlighting how the decisive moment emerged from a mixture of documented fact, partial record, and the realities of combat. The decisive minutes at Midway have generated a broad spectrum of interpretations among historians, naval analysts, and military theorists. These interpretations, shaped by evolving access to documents and changing perspectives on carrier warfare, continue to influence understanding of how the battle unfolded and why the outcome emerged so sharply. The interpretations differ not in the recognition of the battle's importance, but in the weight they assign to specific causes, decisions, and structural factors. Examining these schools of thought reveals how the passage of time and the expansion of available evidence have reshaped the narrative of Midway without altering its central significance. The traditional interpretation, which dominated post-war analysis, emphasized the role of American intelligence and the strategic foresight of Admiral Chester Nimitz. This view holds that the cracking of Japanese codes, combined with decisive positioning of American carriers based on accurate intelligence estimates, created the foundation for American success. Advocates of this interpretation highlight the ability of U.S. intelligence officers to identify Midway as the target of the Japanese operation, and the careful preparations undertaken in response. The traditional school maintains that American commanders acted with determination and calm, launching their aircraft early and ensuring that they arrived in the general vicinity of the Japanese carriers at the right time. Within this framework, the dive bomber's arrival during the vulnerable deck cycle appears as the culmination of coordinated planning rather than a fortunate convergence. A second school of thought, often described as revisionist, places greater emphasis on Japanese operational vulnerabilities and internal decision-making. This perspective argues that the underlying cause of the Japanese defeat lay in rigid doctrine, inflexible command structures, and an overextension of forces across too wide an operational front. Revisionist analysts point to the dispersal of Japanese reconnaissance assets, the dual demands of striking midway and preparing for fleet engagement, and the structural inefficiencies in rearming procedures. They argue that these factors created systemic vulnerabilities that would have been exposed regardless of American intelligence advantages. Within this interpretation, the arrival of American dive bombers at precisely the wrong moment for Japanese operations becomes less a matter of American planning and more a reflection of the inherent fragility of Japan's carrier doctrine under unexpected pressure. A third interpretation, advanced by scholars with access to Japanese language sources and post-war interviews, emphasizes the role of cumulative friction, small disruptions that compounded to create significant operational delays. This perspective examines the minor mechanical issues that delayed certain reconnaissance launches, the fragmented nature of sighting reports, and the repeated reversals of rearmament orders. Proponents of this school argue that no single decision determined the outcome. Rather, the accumulation of small inefficiencies created a cascade of delays that left the Japanese carriers exposed at a critical moment. This analysis seeks to integrate the broader operational context with the moment-by-moment details preserved in surviving records, offering a narrative that highlights the interdependencies of scouting, deck operations, and defensive readiness. Another interpretation centers on the human dimension of decision-making. Scholars within this tradition analyze how the stress of command, limited information, and the expectations of doctrine shaped the actions of individuals aboard the Japanese carriers. They assess Nagumo's hesitation to commit to an anti-ship strike, the pressure faced by reconnaissance pilots to provide accurate information quickly, and the burden placed on deck crews attempting to implement rapidly changing orders. This perspective does not suggest fault or negligence, but emphasizes how the human experience of war, uncertainty, fatigue, and cognitive overload contributed to the timing and vulnerability that made the decisive 5-minute window possible. A contrasting viewpoint highlights American perseverance and tactical adaptation. This interpretation stresses the determination of American torpedo squadrons to press their attacks despite overwhelming odds, the willingness of dive bomber leaders to modify their routes based on real-time observations, and the ability of American commanders to coordinate operations under complex conditions. Scholars in this tradition assert that the success of the dive bombers reflected not only fortunate timing, but also the operational flexibility that allowed American aviators to compensate for initial navigational errors and arrive over the Japanese fleet during its most vulnerable state. This perspective emphasizes leadership at the squadron and flight level, where individual decisions shaped outcomes in ways not easily predicted by higher command. A more recent analytical framework examines Midway through the lens of organizational theory. This approach explores how institutional culture, training systems, and command hierarchies influence the behavior of both navies. It highlights how the Japanese naval aviation system, designed around elite pre-war training programs, lacked the capacity to regenerate experienced aircrew rapidly once engaged in large-scale conflict. Conversely, the American training system, though initially less refined, possessed greater scalability. Analysts using this method argue that Midway represented not only a tactical turning point, but also a demonstration of how organizational structures influence wartime resilience. Some interpretations focus specifically on the technological dimension. These analyses compare aircraft performance, anti-aircraft systems, deck operations, and communication equipment between the two navies. They note that American dive bombers, though not superior in raw performance, benefited from robust dive brakes and durable construction, allowing them to execute steep dives with reliability. Meanwhile, Japanese carriers, though formidable offensively, possess structural vulnerabilities related to fuel handling systems and hangar ventilation that accelerated the spread of fires once bombs struck. This perspective emphasizes how design choices informed by pre-war assumptions influenced the carrier's survivability. Another interpretive trend highlights the role of chance. Scholars in this tradition caution against overemphasizing planning or doctrinal analysis, arguing that certain elements of the battle depended on variables outside human control. These include cloud formations that concealed the American dive bombers during their approach, the missed sightings that caused some Japanese scouts to overlook American ships, and the specific sequence of events that placed Japanese combat air patrols at low altitude. This school does not deny the importance of planning or doctrine, but asserts that the convergence of timing, visibility, and human decisions contained elements of unpredictability that contributed to the outcome. Despite differences in emphasis, these interpretive schools intersect in several key conclusions. All acknowledge the decisive impact of the 5-minute attack window and the catastrophic damage inflicted on the Japanese carriers. All recognize that the timing of the American dive bomber arrival coincided with a moment of extraordinary vulnerability shaped by earlier decisions. All agree that the battle marked a strategic turning point in the Pacific War, altering the balance of naval power and shifting the momentum toward the United States. The evolving interpretations of Midway illustrate how history is shaped not only by events but by the questions asked of them. As new documents emerge and analytical methods develop, the understanding of these decisive minutes becomes more nuanced. Yet, the essential significance remains unchanged. The choices, constraints, and conditions that converged on June 4th, 1942 created an interval in which the outcome of a vast conflict was reshaped with remarkable speed. The reconstruction of the decisive minutes at Midway relies on a diverse set of historical tools and analytical methods that together create a layered picture of events. These tools compensate for the incomplete, fragmented, or contradictory nature of the surviving primary sources. Historians and military analysts draw on archival records, technical assessments, operational logs, oral histories, and battlefield forensics to approximate the timing, sequence, and implications of the actions taken that morning. No single method provides a complete account. Instead, the convergence of multiple approaches forms the most accurate understanding of the battle's critical interval. Archival research forms the backbone of Midway studies. Historians examine preserved Japanese and American records, including war diaries, after-action reports, intelligence summaries, and fleet communications. These documents, stored across various national archives, provide foundational data on timing, decision-making, and unit composition. American records are generally more complete due to the survival of fleet archives and intelligence reports. Japanese records, by contrast, are fragmentary. Many were lost during the war, destroyed intentionally to prevent capture, or damaged aboard the carriers as they burned. The surviving Japanese sources require careful cross-referencing to compensate for their gaps. Researchers compare officer reports with ship logs, communication transcripts, and doctrinal manuals to reconstruct operational intent and command constraints. Signal intelligence records contribute another essential dimension. The preserved documentation from American code-breaking units allows historians to trace how analysts identified Midway as the operational target and how their assessments informed fleet movements. These records reveal the methods used to break key components of Japanese naval codes, the frequency patterns that hinted at impending operations, and the communication behaviors that enabled analysts to confirm their predictions. By integrating these intelligence archives with fleet action reports, historians can determine how strategic foresight shaped American positioning during the battle. Technical analysis provides additional insight into how the carriers were struck and why the damage escalated so quickly. Naval architects and ordnance specialists have examined the structural features of the Japanese carriers, analyzing their deck arrangements, fuel handling systems, and magazine layouts. These analyses draw on surviving ship plans, pre-war blueprints, and interviews with engineers familiar with the carrier's construction. They help explain how bomb impacts penetrated decks, ignited fuel vapors, and triggered sequences of explosions. Technical studies also assess how American dive bomber ordnance functioned upon impact, including fuse sensitivity, penetration performance, and blast effects. This method reveals not only the cause of catastrophic fires, but also how design vulnerabilities contributed to the rapid loss of each carrier. Aircraft performance analysis is another tool used to understand the battle. Aviation historians and engineers examine the flight characteristics of the American and Japanese aircraft involved, using preserved technical manuals, wind tunnel data, and modern test reconstructions. These assessments help explain why American dive bombers were able to execute steep-angle attacks with stability, why Japanese fighters had difficult intercepting attackers descending from altitude, and how torpedo planes' limitations affected their survivability. By comparing performance data across aircraft types, researchers can evaluate how technological factors shape tactical outcomes. Oral histories form a valuable but complex component of Midway research. Interviews with surviving aviators, deck crews, and officers provide first-hand accounts that capture the human dimension of decision-making and combat conditions. These narratives supply details not recorded in official documents, including personal observations of smoke patterns, deck congestion, radio chatter, and the visual appearance of enemy formations. However, oral histories also require careful contextualization. Memory distortion, retrospective interpretation, and the stress of combat can introduce inaccuracies. Historians cross-reference oral accounts with archival records and technical data to determine which details align with other forms of evidence. Chronological reconstruction is another essential method. Researchers build detailed timelines that align multiple streams of evidence, including ship logs, aircraft launch times, reconnaissance reports, and bomb impact assessments. This process involves integrating information recorded in different time zones, correcting for delays in message transmission, and accounting for discrepancies arising from damaged or incomplete records. The result is a synchronized sequence that approximates the timing of key decisions, sightings, launches, and attacks. Timeline reconstruction allows analysts to determine, as precisely as possible, when Japanese carriers were most exposed and when the American dive bombers commenced their attacks. Geospatial analysis aids in this reconstruction by mapping the positions and movements of each fleet. Historians use navigational data, ship logs, and reported bearings to model fleet positions on digital or physical maps. This approach helps clarify how American strike groups located the Japanese carriers, how cloud formations influenced approach paths, and how defensive maneuvers altered ship positions during the attack. By situating fleet movements within the broader geography of the Central Pacific, geospatial analysis clarifies the relationship between positioning, timing, and visibility. Damage assessment methodologies further illuminate the consequences of bomb impacts. Naval analysts examine blast patterns, fire propagation, and structural failures to determine how the carriers succumbed to damage. This method integrates photographic evidence from reconnaissance flights, survivor testimony, and engineering analysis. Damage assessment also helps clarify how secondary explosions contributed to the rapid loss of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. These findings support broader conclusions about the vulnerability of Japanese carrier design, particularly the concentration of fuel and ordnance handling areas near key structural supports. Comparative doctrinal analysis provides another layer of understanding. Scholars examine pre-war and wartime training manuals, operational guidelines, and fleet instructions to determine how doctrine influenced decisions during the battle. This method reveals the structural logic behind Nagumo's hesitation, the sequencing of Japanese airstrikes, and the expectation that reconnaissance would provide clarity before committing to an anti-ship attack. The same approach sheds light on American doctrine, which emphasized flexible initiative among squadron leaders and integrated intelligence analysis into operational planning. By comparing doctrinal structures, historians assess how each Navy's guiding principles shaped the choices made on June 4th. Modern digital tools have expanded the analytical repertoire available to researchers. Computer simulations model carrier operations under varying conditions, testing how different sequences of orders might have altered exposure windows. These simulations incorporate known variables such as aircraft fuel requirements, rearming speed, flight deck capacity, and defensive fighter allocation. While simulations cannot replicate every factor, they help illustrate the consequences of timing and sequencing that contributed to the decisive interval. Historians also employ textual criticism to evaluate conflicting accounts. This method assesses the reliability, context, and potential biases within documents, helping determine how to reconcile discrepancies among sources. For example, when Japanese officers provided differing explanations for delayed reconnaissance reports, Textual criticism helps interpret why these accounts diverge and which elements align with other evidence. The same approach is applied to American pilot debriefings, some of which contain variations in course descriptions or attack sequences. Photographic analysis contributes further detail. Although limited, photographs taken during and after the battle supply visual evidence of deck conditions, fire damage, and ship positioning. Analysts study these images to verify structural damage patterns, confirm the presence or absence of aircraft on decks at specific moments, and assess environmental conditions such as cloud cover and sea state. Photographs taken during the retreat of the Japanese remnants further document the aftermath of the decisive interval and the scale of the destruction. Together, these methods, archival study, technical analysis, oral history, geospatial modeling, doctrinal comparison, and digital simulation, allow historians to reconstruct a complex sequence of events from limited surviving material. The convergence of these tools forms a comprehensive understanding of how the decisive minutes at Midway unfolded, demonstrating that historical knowledge rests not on a single source, but on the alignment of multiple forms of evidence that illuminate different facets of the same event. The historical record of the critical minutes at Midway presents a mixture of well-established facts and areas where evidence remains incomplete or uncertain. The combination of surviving documents, testimonies, technical analyses, and reconnaissance reports allows historians to reconstruct the general sequence of events with confidence. Yet the precise mechanisms behind certain decisions, timing intervals, and internal dynamics aboard the Japanese carriers remain only partially known. The distinction between what can be documented and what must be inferred forms an essential part of understanding how the 5-minute interval unfolded and why its impact was so decisive. Several elements of the battle are known with a high degree of certainty. The timing of the American dive bomber attacks is among the most well-documented aspects. Records from Enterprise's and Yorktown's air groups, cross-referenced with Japanese survivor testimonies and radio logs, confirm that the American strike arrived shortly after 10:20 a.m. local time. Within the next several minutes, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu sustained direct hits that ignited fuel and ordnance, rendering them fatally damaged. The simultaneous arrival of multiple American squadrons is supported by numerous accounts, confirming that the carriers were struck in rapid succession rather than through extended waves of attack. The vulnerability of the Japanese carriers at that moment is also firmly established. Documentation indicates that flight decks were occupied by aircraft in various stages of refueling or rearming. Surviving Japanese logs describe fuel hoses laid across the decks, bomb carts positioned near aircraft, and ordnance stored temporarily in ways that reflected the disruptions caused by shifting orders. American pilots consistently reported observing flight decks crowded with aircraft and equipment. Technical analysis of the resulting fires confirms that volatile fuel vapor and exposed ordnance contributed significantly to the intensity of the explosions that followed. Another well-supported fact concerns the disposition of Japanese combat air patrols. Records demonstrate that many fighters were engaged at low altitude intercepting American torpedo bombers during the period immediately preceding the dive bomber attack. This left the upper airspace relatively unguarded. The pattern aligns with American accounts noting minimal resistance during their final approach. While precise altitude and number estimates differ, the general state of the Japanese air defense system is clearly documented. Certain elements of Japanese decision-making during the crucial period are also well established. Orders issued by Nagumo's staff to reconfigure aircraft for a second strike on Midway, followed by instructions to prepare for an anti-ship attack, are confirmed in multiple surviving records. The timing of these reversals is partially preserved in officer reports and deck logs, though the precise minute-by-minute sequence remains subject to debate. These records demonstrate the operational uncertainty surrounding reconnaissance reports and highlight the difficulty Japanese commanders faced in managing competing demands under time pressure. American intelligence assessments leading up to the battle fall into the category of well-documented facts. Code-breaking efforts at Station Haipo successfully identified Midway as the target of the Japanese operation, enabling Nimitz to position American carriers in advance. Records show that American commanders relied heavily on these intelligence reports and launched their aircraft with confidence that the Japanese carriers were operating within a predictable range. The role of intelligence in shaping American strategy is supported by extensive archival evidence. Despite these well-established elements, several critical details remain uncertain or only partially understood. One of the most significant uncertainties involves the exact stage of the Japanese rearmament process when the American dive bombers arrived. Survivor testimonies provide conflicting accounts regarding whether aircraft were fully fueled, partially fueled, or awaiting fuel distribution. Some officers described substantial quantities of unused ordnance still being stored in hangars, while others recalled aircraft already armed and positioned for launch. The limited availability of detailed deck logs, many of which were destroyed during the attacks, prevents complete clarity on this point. Another area of uncertainty relates to the initial reconnaissance sighting that identified American ships. The report from Tone's scout plane is preserved, but the delay between initial contact and confirmation of a carrier's presence remains difficult to determine with precision. Survivor accounts and officer testimonies vary in their descriptions of whether the delay was caused by radio difficulties, incomplete identification, or procedural caution. The uncertainty affects interpretations of how quickly Nagumo could have responded to the threat. The exact flight paths and adjustment decisions made by American dive bomber formations also contain gaps. While their general approach direction is clear, the specific bearings and altitude adjustments made as they search for the Japanese carriers are reconstructed primarily from pilot recollections and a small number of surviving navigation notes. The influence of cloud cover, visibility conditions, and fuel concerns on these adjustments cannot be reconstructed with perfect accuracy. These uncertainties do not obscure the broader trajectory of the approach, but make precise mapping challenging. The timing of bomb impacts aboard the Japanese carriers also contains minor but notable ambiguities. While all sources agree that Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were struck within minutes of one another, the exact sequence of impacts is less certain. Many witnesses experienced the attack simultaneously and recalled events through the lens of immediate shock and disorientation. Some records suggest Kaga was hit first, followed closely by Akagi and Soryu. Others present slight variations. The lack of continuous internal reporting during the attacks limits the precision of these reconstructions. The internal progression of fires aboard each carrier remains another area of incomplete detail. Structural damage reports, where preserved, offer broad descriptions of fuel-fed fires spreading rapidly through hangar decks. However, the specific pathways through which flames and explosions propagated vary across accounts. Some Japanese officers attributed the rapid spread to ruptured fuel lines, while others emphasized the presence of munitions awaiting movement due to disrupted rearming procedures. Without surviving structural records or detailed fire logs, the exact mechanisms cannot be fully documented. The number of Japanese fighters available at mid or high altitude during the critical minutes is another uncertain detail. Japanese carrier records suffered heavy losses, and pilot testimonies sometimes conflict regarding their altitude and engagement status. While the general absence of fighters at altitude is well supported, the exact scale of the defensive vacuum remains partially speculative. American records, though far more complete, also contain gaps. Some squadron debriefs lack detail on navigation challenges, fuel status, or last-minute adjustments. The stress of combat and the loss of certain pilots limited the completeness of available accounts. These gaps leave elements of squadron coordination partially understood. Nevertheless, the established facts outweigh the missing details in their relevance to the broader historical outcome. The Japanese carriers were in a vulnerable state due to rearmament delays, reconnaissance uncertainties, and defensive overstretch. American dive bombers arrived during a narrow interval in which those vulnerabilities converged. The combination of documented conditions and observed impact results provides a reliable picture of why the carriers were lost so swiftly. The missing details, while important for granular reconstruction, do not undermine the central understanding of the decisive moment. Instead, they reflect the inherent limitations of reconstructing a complex battle fought across vast distances, constrained by the destruction of records and filtered through human recollection. The result is a historical narrative that is both firmly grounded in established fact and shaped by areas where evidence must be inferred with caution. The decisive minutes at Midway left behind a limited but revealing collection of personal observations from individuals who experienced the event directly. Aviators, deck crews, damage control personnel, and command staff from both the American and Japanese carriers. These first-hand accounts, preserved through official debriefings, memoirs, interviews, and fragments of wartime diaries, illuminate the human dimension of a complex naval battle conducted under extreme operational pressure. Their descriptions, factual and restrained, provide insight into the conditions on the flight decks, the atmosphere within command centers, and the physical and emotional demands placed on those who fought through the decisive interval. On the Japanese carriers, crew members reported a sense of accelerated routine during the minutes preceding the attack. Eyewitness accounts describe aircraft positioned closely together on the flight decks, teams working to replace ordnance loads, and the smell of aviation fuel accumulating as hoses remained connected for extended periods. Deck crews recalled the difficulty of maneuvering bomb carts across congested surfaces while attempting to implement rapidly shifting orders. Many of these men, trained to operate within strict procedural frameworks, noted that the sequence of rearming operations felt unusually disjointed due to repeated interruptions. One surviving Soryu deck crewman later described the moment the first American dive bombers appeared overhead. His account noted the sudden contrast between the focused activity on the deck and the abrupt arrival of aircraft descending at steep angles. He recalled the rapid shift from task-oriented concentration to immediate alarm, shaped by the sight of bomb silhouettes against the sky. His testimony indicated that defensive fire began quickly, but lacked coordination due to the surprise and altitude of the attackers. Aboard Akagi, several officers recounted the transitional atmosphere within the ship's command center. They described deliberations regarding reconnaissance reports, the attempt to reconcile contradictory messages, and the effort to sequence rearming operations without compromising readiness. One officer remembered hearing the alert for incoming aircraft only moments before the first explosions. His testimony noted that the shock of the impact interrupted communication lines and created immediate confusion as personnel attempted to assess damage while smoke-filled compartments. Accounts from Kaga's crew similarly described the sudden onset of crisis. A surviving mechanic reported hearing the initial dive from American aircraft without immediately understanding their origin. He described noticing aircraft diving from above the cloud layer, recognizing their dive angle, and realizing that interception would be difficult due to their altitude and speed. His recollection emphasized the abrupt shift from anticipation of launch to the urgent need for firefighting and evacuation. The American accounts offer a complementary perspective. Aviators from the dive bomber squadrons described long flights over open ocean with limited visibility, the strain of navigating by estimated bearings, and the uncertainty of whether they would locate the Japanese fleet before fuel limitations forced a return. One pilot from Enterprise's scouting squadron recalled adjusting his course based on subtle changes in ship wakes visible through gaps in the clouds. His testimony noted the moment when the carriers came into view, describing their movement as structured and deliberate rather than dramatic. His account emphasized the disciplined execution of dive procedures shaped by extensive training rather than emotion. Another aviator from Bombing Squadron 6 described the internal focus required during the dive. He recalled aligning the aircraft with the target, deploying dive brakes, and maintaining concentration despite intense anti-aircraft fire. His notes from a post-flight debrief highlighted the importance of maintaining dive angles, adjusting timing for bomb release, and observing the spread of fires after impact. He described the sight of explosions on the carriers as an operational observation rather than an emotional one, focusing on the effect of the strikes on deck conditions. Torpedo Squadron crewmen provided additional perspectives on the difficulty of their attack runs. Survivors from these units recalled flying at low altitude through heavy defensive fire, aware of the limited maneuverability of their aircraft. Their accounts emphasized determination to press forward despite recognizing the near impossibility of achieving accurate torpedo drops under such conditions. These testimonies underline the role played by their attacks in pulling Japanese fighters downward, although the aviators themselves did not fully comprehend this effect at the time. Aboard the American carriers, deck crews and support personnel also recorded their experiences. Yorktown's log entries, combined with later statements from damage control teams, reveal the rapid adaptation required after sustaining bomb damage earlier in the day. Crew members described the effort to contain fires, restore power, and maintain launch capability. One damage control officer recalled working in smoke-filled compartments, coordinating ventilation efforts, and receiving intermittent updates about incoming enemy aircraft. His account underscored the resilience of the crew and the structured discipline that allowed Yorktown to remain operational for longer than expected. Command-level accounts offer insight into decision-making during the final approach of the dive bombers. Officers from Enterprise recorded the rationale behind allowing squadron leaders to continue searching beyond planned coordinates. Their testimonies describe confidence in the aviator's judgment and reliance on the structured training that encouraged tactical initiative. These accounts reflect a command environment in which flexibility was integrated into operational planning, enabling squadrons to adjust in real time based on observed conditions. On the Japanese carriers, damage control personnel provided some of the most vivid factual descriptions of the minutes following the bomb impacts. One officer aboard Akagi described how fires expanded rapidly along the hangar deck, fueled by vaporized gasoline and ignited ordnance. He noted attempts to isolate compartments and cut fuel lines, but his account emphasizes how the speed of fire spread, outpaced available response measures. Similarly, a crewman aboard Keiga described hearing secondary explosions, followed by the collapse of interior passageways, making coordinated movement difficult. These accounts also reflect the physical environment aboard the carriers. Several Japanese survivors described navigating through narrow corridors filled with smoke, heat, and debris. Their testimonies emphasize the difficulty of moving between compartments while attempting to assess damage or reach evacuation points. The testimonies avoid emotional embellishment, but present a factual view of the conditions that prevailed in the aftermath of the attacks. American aviators returning to their carriers provided brief observational accounts of the destruction sustained by the Japanese fleet. Some described the sight of smoke columns rising from the carriers, while others focused on maintaining formation discipline during the flight back to their ships. Their priority remained operational safety rather than detailed observation. These accounts contribute to a clear but restrained depiction of the immediate aftermath. Japanese officers who survived the attacks described the process of abandoning ship when fires became uncontrollable. Their testimonies included descriptions of final efforts to rescue crew members, destroy sensitive documents, and prevent further explosions. The calmness with which many of these actions were performed reflects the structured discipline ingrained within the Japanese naval service rather than emotional resignation. Taken together, these voices from the carriers provide a multi-layered perspective on the decisive interval at Midway. Their accounts capture the procedural environment, the sudden onset of crisis, and the disciplined responses shaped by training and doctrine. They form an essential component of the historical record, grounding the analysis of the battle in the lived experiences of those who acted within the constraints and pressures of naval warfare. The destruction of 3 Japanese carriers within the decisive minutes of June 4th, followed by the loss of Hiryu later that day, produced a strategic shift whose effects extended far beyond the Central Pacific. The immediate tactical outcome, Japan's failure to seize Midway and the loss of 4 first-line fleet carriers, marked only the beginning of a much broader transformation. The battle altered the trajectory of the Pacific War, reshaped the balance of naval power, and influenced global perceptions of the conflict's eventual direction. Nations observing from afar re-evaluated the likelihood of Axis victory, and the strategic calculus of both Allied and Axis planners changed irreversibly. The most direct consequence of the battle was the collapse of Japan's ability to conduct large-scale carrier operations with the same force and tempo that characterized its early wartime successes. Prior to Midway, the first carrier striking force represented the core of Japan's offensive capability. Its coordinated air groups, seasoned pilots, and integrated doctrine had enabled rapid expansion across vast areas. The loss of 4 carriers not only removed significant physical assets, but also inflicted a severe blow to the trained aviator corps that formed the backbone of Japan's naval air power. The Japanese training system, structured around producing small numbers of elite pilots through lengthy programs, lacked the capacity to replace these losses quickly. American naval planners recognized this shift immediately. Communications from Pacific Fleet headquarters in the weeks following Midway reflected growing confidence that Japanese offensive capacity had been significantly reduced. Although Japan retained operational strength in other theaters, including strong surface forces and land-based air units, the coordinated carrier strike capability that had defined Japanese operations at Pearl Harbor, in the Indian Ocean, and across Southeast Asia had been compromised. This loss forced Japan to reconsider the objectives and timetables of planned operations, resulting in a strategic retrenchment. The battle also influenced Japan's ability to protect its extended perimeter. Prior to Midway, Japan's defensive network across the central and southwestern Pacific relied on the assumption that carrier forces could be shifted rapidly to threatened sectors. After the battle, the reduced number of carriers limited Japan's capacity to respond to simultaneous challenges. This constraint became evident in later campaigns, particularly in the Solomon Islands, where Japanese forces struggled to maintain supply lines and reinforce frontline units during the prolonged battles around Guadalcanal. The inability to provide consistent carrier air cover weakened Japan's operational flexibility, which had been a defining strength earlier in the war. Midway also shifted American strategic momentum. For the first time since the attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States possessed a clear and sustainable advantage in carrier strength. Although American losses earlier in the war had been significant, the industrial capacity of the United States ensured that new carriers and aircraft were already in production. The knowledge that replacement ships were forthcoming allowed American planners to adopt more assertive strategies. Within months, the United States transitioned from defensive operations to a sustained offensive campaign across the Pacific, beginning with the Guadalcanal landings in August 1942. The shift in momentum influenced Allied strategy more broadly. In Washington and London, officials began to reassess the allocation of resources between the Pacific and European theaters. While Europe remained the primary focus for Allied strategy, the success at Midway demonstrated that the Pacific campaign was not only winnable, but also capable of advancing more rapidly than previously assumed. This reassessment influenced decisions regarding troop movements, naval deployments, and logistical planning. Midway thus shaped strategic priorities across multiple theaters. Among Axis partners, the battle's consequences were observed closely. German military leadership, monitoring the progress of Japan's campaigns, had previously viewed the Pacific War as a complementary front that could tie down American resources. After Midway, German analysts noted the shift in naval balance and anticipated increased American freedom of action. Japanese leaders, in turn, recognized the reduced likelihood of obtaining material assistance from Germany and Italy, as Axis coordination remained limited by geography and logistics. The strategic independence of each Axis member became more pronounced as a result. In the Soviet Union, Midway's impact was assessed in relation to Japan's northern strategic posture. Prior to the battle, Soviet planners considered the possibility of renewed Japanese pressure along the border with Manchuria or into Siberia. The loss of Japanese carriers and the stalled offensive momentum reduced the likelihood of Japan initiating major northern operations. This shift contributed to Soviet confidence in maintaining a defensive stance in the Far East, while focusing resources on the German front. The long-term consequences of Midway extended into the industrial and training realms. Japan's naval aviation program faced increasing difficulty replacing both aircraft and trained personnel. The need to protect remaining carriers forced Japan to adopt more cautious operational patterns, reducing opportunities for pilots to gain combat experience. American pilots, by contrast, benefited from continuous operations supported by expanding training pipelines. The numerical advantage in aircrew and aircraft production widened steadily in favor of the United States, making strategic recovery nearly impossible for Japan despite later attempts to rebuild carrier strength. Midway also influenced naval doctrine worldwide. The concentrated loss of carriers demonstrated the vulnerability inherent in carrier operations when caught during deck cycles or periods of reduced air defense. Navies studying the battle in subsequent decades noted the importance of robust reconnaissance, flexible doctrine, and distributed carrier formations. The battle provided a case study in how timing, sequencing, and intelligence integration could determine outcomes, despite parity or superiority in physical assets. These lessons shaped carrier doctrine in the post-war era and influenced naval strategy among emerging powers. Beyond the immediate military implications, Midway shifted global perceptions of the war's direction. Nations across Asia, including those under Japanese occupation, observed the battle's outcome as an indication that Japanese dominance in the region might not be permanent. This perception influenced political movements, resistance efforts, and local assessments of future power balances. Likewise, colonial administrations in Southeast Asia and the Pacific re-evaluated expectations of Japanese expansion, anticipating increased Allied counterpressure. In the United States, Midway held significance as the first major naval victory since the beginning of the war. While the public did not initially receive detailed information about the scale of Japanese losses, internal reports circulated among political and military leaders shaped assessments of wartime progress. The shift in morale supported expanded mobilization and helped justify accelerated industrial production, reinforcing the national commitment to sustained Pacific operations. Taken as a whole, the global consequences of Midway emerged from a combination of immediate losses and long-term strategic shifts. The destruction of 4 Japanese carriers precipitated a decline in Japanese offensive capacity, while American forces gained both material and psychological momentum. The battle altered strategic expectations across the Allied and Axis powers, influencing decisions made in multiple theaters of war. It demonstrated the significance of carrier warfare in determining the outcome of modern naval conflicts, and reshaped the balance of power in the Pacific for the remainder of the war. The decisive minutes at Midway revealed a series of enduring lessons about the fragility of complex military operations, conducted under conditions of uncertainty, time pressure, and logistical strain. These lessons extend beyond the technical aspects of carrier warfare and illuminate broader principles relevant to strategy, decision-making, training, and organizational resilience. The battle demonstrated how systems that appear strong under ideal conditions can become vulnerable when exposed to unexpected disruptions, and how the interaction of doctrine, intelligence, and human judgment shapes outcomes in ways not fully predictable from material strength alone. One central lesson concerns the importance of operational flexibility. Japanese naval aviation doctrine emphasized meticulously timed sequences, coordinated waves, and centralized decision-making. This approach proved highly effective when Japanese commanders controlled the tempo of operations and possessed clear intelligence regarding enemy movements. However, the same rigidity limited their ability to adapt once reconnaissance reports proved incomplete. Enemy resistance emerged at unanticipated intervals, and launch cycles were interrupted by the need to recover returning aircraft. The delays in rearming and reconfiguring aircraft created exposure conditions that doctrine did not fully accommodate. The battle demonstrated that systems optimized for ideal conditions may struggle when confronted with irregularities or unexpected challenges. A related lesson involves the critical role of intelligence integration. The success of American operations rested not only on the bravery of aviators, but on the effective use of intelligence derived from code-breaking efforts. American commanders were able to position their carriers advantageously because they understood Japanese operational intentions and could anticipate the general timing of the fleet's movements. This advanced knowledge allowed them to launch aircraft, despite limited direct reconnaissance. Midway highlighted how intelligence, when combined with disciplined planning and commanders willing to act on incomplete but contextually accurate information, can compensate for material disadvantages. Another lesson concerns the management of risk within operational systems. The Japanese decision to maintain a dual-purpose rearmament posture, preparing for both a second strike on Midway and a potential fleet action, reflected a desire to preserve strategic options. However, this attempt to manage multiple objectives simultaneously increased flight deck congestion and prolonged exposure during critical moments. The effort to retain flexibility at the strategic level paradoxically reduced the ability to respond quickly at the tactical level. Midway illustrated that attempting to hedge against multiple contingencies can create vulnerabilities if the operational system lacks the capacity to support rapid transitions. The battle also demonstrated the significance of decentralized initiative. American squadron leaders, operating under broad mission directives rather than strict flight path instructions, made independent decisions that ultimately enabled the successful attack on the Japanese carriers. When initial bearings proved inaccurate, aviators adjusted courses based on visual cues and navigational judgment. Their flexibility allowed them to exploit windows of opportunity not foreseen in pre-flight planning. This decentralized decision-making contrasted with Japanese doctrine, which relied heavily on centralized coordination and precise sequencing. The lesson is not a categorical endorsement of decentralization, but an illustration of how systems that empower individuals at lower levels can respond effectively to unexpected developments. Another important lesson relates to the vulnerability inherent in complex logistical operations. Carrier flight decks functioned as tightly choreographed environments in which fueling, arming, positioning, and launching aircraft required precise coordination. When multiple operations occurred simultaneously, especially under time pressure, small inefficiencies accumulated into significant vulnerabilities. Exposed fuel lines, partially armed aircraft, and congested hangar decks created conditions in which even a small breach could trigger catastrophic damage. The battle demonstrated that logistical operations must be designed not only for efficiency, but also for resilience under disrupted conditions. The destruction of the Japanese carriers also underscored the importance of redundancy in military systems. The loss of experienced aviators, specialized maintenance personnel, and irreplaceable carriers had effects far beyond the immediate tactical defeat. Japan's aviation training programs were not structured to regenerate strength rapidly, and its industrial capacity could not match American production rates. The absence of redundancy, both in human capital and material, meant that the losses sustained at Midway could not be recovered. In contrast, American training programs and shipbuilding efforts scaled rapidly, providing strategic depth that supported sustained operations. The lesson extends beyond naval war. Systems dependent on small, highly specialized elements are vulnerable to attrition when engaged in prolonged conflict. A further lesson involves the integration of reconnaissance into operational planning. Midway demonstrated that even highly capable forces can become vulnerable when blind to enemy movements. The limited Japanese reconnaissance effort, influenced by assumptions about American carrier readiness and by the dispersal of scout planes across multiple operational areas, created a gap in situational awareness that proved decisive. American commanders, by contrast, benefited from layered reconnaissance, land-based aircraft from Midway, carrier scouts, and intelligence centered on code breaking. The battle highlighted the necessity of comprehensive reconnaissance coverage and the dangers of assuming that enemy forces cannot approach undetected. Midway also underscored the influence of timing in operational environments. The American dive bombers arrived during a narrow interval in which the Japanese carriers were engaged in recovery and rearming operations. This period was inherently vulnerable due to the presence of fuel hoses, exposed ordnance, and aircraft positioned in non-defensive configurations. The significance of timing reflects an enduring aspect of military operations. Windows of advantage or vulnerability may be brief, and the ability to exploit or protect against them often determines outcomes. Midway demonstrated that situational awareness, operational tempo, and the sequencing of actions must be synchronized carefully to minimize exposure at critical moments. A more subtle lesson involves the relationship between doctrine and the evolving nature of warfare. Japanese naval aviation doctrine was shaped by pre-war training, inter-service competition, and earlier operational successes. Yet the speed of wartime technological development, combined with the complexity of multi-carrier engagements, meant that doctrine required continuous adaptation. The inability to modify established practices rapidly, especially in areas such as rearming sequences, reconnaissance allocation, and fighter direction, limited the Japanese capacity to respond effectively to new challenges. Midway revealed that doctrinal rigidity can become a liability when the operational environment shifts faster than institutional practices evolve. The battle also highlighted the importance of command communication under pressure. Japanese command staff faced a situation in which incomplete reconnaissance, shifting priorities, and incoming attacks forced rapid judgments. Communication lines were strained by the need to coordinate deck operations, issue defensive orders, and process reconnaissance updates simultaneously. The resulting delays and uncertainties illustrate how communication overload can impair decision-making. American forces faced similar pressures but benefited from decentralized decision structures that reduced the burden on centralized command posts. Finally, Midway provided a clear demonstration of how uncertainty shapes operations. Both sides entered the battle with incomplete information, forced to interpret ambiguous signals and make decisions under conditions of risk. The outcome showed that uncertainty cannot be eliminated, but must be managed through resilient systems, flexible doctrine, and effective integration of intelligence and observation. The battle taught that in modern warfare, the capacity to operate effectively under uncertainty is as important as the ability to deliver decisive force. These lessons reveal Midway as not only a moment of dramatic operational reversal, but also a case study in the fragility of complex systems exposed to stress. The forces that converge in the decisive interval, doctrinal assumptions, intelligence, timing, logistical strain, and human judgment, continue to inform military analysis and strategic thought long after the guns fell silent. The hours following the decisive interval of June 4, 1942 unfolded in a manner that reflected the irreversible shift already set into motion. The Japanese First Carrier Striking Force, once the nucleus of Japan's naval power, now operated under conditions that diverged sharply from its pre-battle expectations. Smoke rose from the damaged carriers, communication systems faltered, and the coherence that had defined earlier operations dissolved amid the expanding pattern of structural loss. Although Hiryu remained operational for a time and launched counterstrikes that temporarily disabled Yorktown, the broader trajectory of the battle had already been determined in the minutes during which Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu sustained damage they could not survive. Japanese commanders attempted to regain control of unfolding events. Officers aboard Hiryu organized retaliatory strikes with the intention of neutralizing the American carriers one at a time. Their efforts, though disciplined and executed with the professionalism characteristic of Japan's naval aviation, were carried out without the support of the larger air group that had been envisioned in pre-battle planning. The situational imbalance was evident. The loss of 3 carriers deprived Hiryu of coordinated reconnaissance and weakened the defensive framework that had previously enabled integrated operations. Although Japanese aviators succeeded in striking Yorktown twice, their ability to deliver sustained pressure diminished as aircraft and crews were lost in successive engagements. American forces, by contrast, benefited from a growing tactical clarity. After recovering dive bombers and assessing the damage inflicted on Japanese forces, American commanders prepared additional strikes to ensure that Hiryu could not escape. Enterprise contributed the majority of aircraft for the afternoon attack, supplemented by Yorktown squadrons that had relocated after their carrier was disabled. The surviving Japanese carrier was identified, approached, and struck with accuracy. The resulting fires and structural damage rendered Hiryu incapable of further flight operations. Her abandonment marked the final collapse of the First Carrier Striking Force as a cohesive entity. In the hours that followed, Japanese surface forces maneuvered to retrieve survivors and withdraw from the engagement area. Their movement reflected the transition from offensive operations to a controlled retreat. The loss of the carriers created a gap in Japan's operational coverage that surface ships alone could not compensate for. Commanders concluded that further attempts to challenge the American fleet carried excessive risk. As Japanese vessels turned westward, they left behind a wide expanse of ocean marked by burning wreckage and debris, evidence of the sudden reversal that had overtaken the operation. American carriers and supporting ships maintained a measured operational posture. Damage control teams aboard Yorktown continued efforts to stabilize the ship long after the primary engagement had concluded. Their discipline and adherence to structured procedures enabled Yorktown to remain afloat despite severe damage. However, subsequent torpedo strikes from a Japanese submarine on June 6th ultimately rendered the ship unsalvageable. Her loss, though significant, did not alter the strategic balance already transformed by the destruction of the Japanese carriers. As the immediate operational crisis subsided, the broader implications of the battle became apparent. American commanders assessed that Midway was secure, and that Japan's ability to threaten Pearl Harbor or expand further into the Central Pacific had been curtailed. The confirmation of this assessment rested not only on the destruction of the carriers, but also on the loss of Japanese air crews, whose experience had represented an irreplaceable component of Japan's naval aviation capability. The strategic significance of the battle lay in the combination of these losses, which collectively reshaped the long-term trajectory of the conflict. The quiet that followed the withdrawal of the Japanese fleet contrasted sharply with the intensity of the 5-minute interval that determined the outcome. On American carriers, crews continued routine operations, recovering aircraft, repairing equipment, and updating logs, reflecting the disciplined structure that underpinned their operational performance. On the Japanese side, survivors rescued by accompanying ships confronted the sudden dissolution of a force that had represented the high point of Japan's naval aviation development. Their accounts reflect an awareness that the loss extended far beyond the ships themselves. Even as the battle ended, the ocean itself bore no visible trace of the strategic shift it had witnessed. The Pacific remained vast and indifferent, yet beneath the surface of calm water lay a profound transformation. The balance of naval power had changed. The initiative that Japan had exercised since December 1941 had been diminished. The United States, though still early in its wartime mobilization, possessed the industrial depth and operational momentum to capitalize on the victory. The wider conflict would continue for more than 3 years, but the direction had been set. The end of the Midway operation did not produce dramatic scenes of triumph or collapse. Instead, it concluded with an atmosphere shaped by reflection, assessment, and transition. Commands prepared reports, analysts reviewed reconnaissance records, crews inventoried equipment. Across thousands of miles, the consequences of the battle began to influence planning boards, diplomatic assessments, and future operations. The significance of Midway lay not in spectacle but in the enduring shift that emerged quietly from the combination of timing, preparation, and the 5-minute sequence that overturned strategic expectations. The vast expanse of the Central Pacific carried the echoes of the Midway battle long after the ships involved had departed. Calm seas replaced the turbulence of combat, and the surface regained the stillness that belied the magnitude of the transformation that had occurred there. The fleets moved away from the engagement zone, leaving only scattered remnants of aircraft and debris to settle slowly into the ocean depths. The carriers that had once defined Japan's naval reach no longer shaped the horizon. Their loss created an absence that strategic planners across the world recognized immediately. In the days that followed, messages traveled between commands, carrying the first assessments of what the battle signified. Analysts identified the shift in naval balance with clarity. The United States, having endured early defeats and significant losses, now possessed a foundation from which to pursue offensive operations. Japan, confronted with the sudden collapse of its premier carrier force, faced the prospect of waging a long conflict without the tools needed to regain initiative. The divergence in trajectory unfolded quietly, yet unmistakably. For the individuals who had taken part in the battle, the return to routine duties provided a sense of continuity, even as they understood that the events they had witnessed marked a decisive turning point. Deck crews resumed maintenance. Pilots reviewed mission notes. Officers prepared detailed reports. Their actions reflected a disciplined commitment to the broader war effort, shaped by an awareness that the outcome of future operations would depend on what had been learned at Midway. As the Pacific settled back into calm, the significance of the battle became part of the larger story of the war. The quiet that followed carried a meaning shaped not by declaration, but by recognition, an understanding that the 5 minutes of June 4th had altered the course of a global conflict with remarkable finality.